Okay, this video is going to serve as a guide on how do we go about selecting or ruling out an appropriate around the world pattern to use, which of course is a specialized one-piece pattern for rackets that have mains, final mains ending at the throat. First, a quick mention of exactly when you're going to use an around the world pattern. Sometimes there seems to be some confusion about this, especially with those new to stringing or new to one-piece stringing. A lot of people have strung two-piece for a long time and then want to learn how to string one-piece and maybe have trouble. Or they've been stringing one-piece and stringing the crosses bottom up, unaware of the potential damage to the frame. Around the world patterns are only if you're choosing to do a one-piece string job and the final mains end at the throat end of the racket. Around the world patterns are used in order to avoid installing the crosses bottom up when doing one-piece stringing on frames where the mains end at the throat. If the final mains end at the head of the racket and not the throat, then you have no need for the use of an around the world pattern. That's exactly why the around the world patterns were created. If your mains end at the head of the racket, that type of frame is perfect for doing the standard natural one-piece string job, as we call it, because one of those mains will just get tied off and the other one will turn the corner and be your top cross, second cross, third, and so forth, and you'll be installing your crosses top down. And that's what the around the world patterns do. They allow you to string a racket, the crosses, after you're done with the mains, or almost done with the mains, the crosses are installed top down, even though the mains would normally end at the throat. And this video is primarily directed at people who are already familiar with one-piece stringing and are familiar with around the world patterns. This is more of a guide on how to figure out maybe which around the world pattern is better for this racket or that racket. No around the world patterns are perfect. None of them are, you can't just pick one around the world pattern and think that it'll be really good for all rackets. Now, if you only string your own racket, or maybe just a couple rackets for you and your family, or you and a couple friends, maybe you only do need to know one around the world pattern if given the correct type of frames. But if you're stringing for multiple people, multiple types of frames, you really want to know the pros and cons of each type of around the world pattern so that you can apply it as needed. If you pigeonhole yourself into thinking that you're just going to use one all the time, for example, one of the around the world patterns is actually called the universal around the world, but it's not universal despite the name, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So for beginning stringers, they sometimes have trouble knowing, well, where are the mains going to end. So briefly, if you're a beginning stringer, or if you have a racket that currently has no strings in it, like this racket, you might not quite know, where do the mains start, and therefore where will the mains end? And I'll go over that very quickly. This racket, which ultimately is going to get strung here, it's a brand new racket, it has never been strung before. I'm going to string it with print synthetic gut with Duraflex. It's not going to be a hybrid, so since it's all going to be a full bed of the same type of string, I would like to string this racket with an around the world pattern, which is what I would normally do. So let's figure out, we're going to go through this and figure out which around the world pattern will I use on this particular frame. And this racket has 6 holes here in the throat. And again, for beginners, or if you don't have, obviously if you've got a racket with strings already in it, you might be able to look and say, okay, there's 4 knots and 2 of them are tied down, 3 of them are tied down here, so you know that the mains end down here. You can go by, obviously it's easier to look at a racket that's already strung, but here's how you do it for a racket that's brand new, never been strung. The grommets aren't pointing in any particular directions or anything like that, giving you any indication. So obviously look on the frame or look it up in the digest. This particular racket is a 16 by 19 pattern. So 16 mains, wherever the mains start, they will end. If there's 6 holes here in the yoke or in the bridge, then your mains start at the throat, and therefore they will end at the throat, which is why this racket might need an around the world pattern if I'm going to string it one piece. If there's 8 holes in the throat bridge, that means your mains start at the head of the racket. And if your mains start at the head of the racket, they're going to end back up at the head of the racket as well, with 16 mains, which is what this racket has. So if it starts at the throat, you'll end up back at the throat after you do 8 trips. If you start at the head, 8 trips back and forth puts you back at the head of the racket. And that's the type of racket. If it started at the head and the mains ended back at the head, that would be that standard one-piece string job or natural one-piece string job where the mains naturally end here and can feed into doing the crosses from the top down. But this racket, like probably, I would say probably more than 50% of rackets that have 16 mains tend to have 6 holes in the throat. Yes, a lot have 8, but probably less than half. So more often than not, if it's got 16 mains, it'll probably have 6 holes down here in the throat, meaning your mains are going to start at the throat and therefore end at the throat. Now if you have a racket that has 14 mains, like Prince Original Graphite, the original mid had 14 mains, or if you have a racket with 18 mains, which there's a number of rackets that have 18 mains currently, then the mains will end at the opposite end from where they started. So for example, most rackets that have 18 mains, it's more common if your racket has 18 mains that you will see 8 holes down here in the throat rather than the 6, although it's not impossible. So if there's 8 holes in the throat and you have 18 mains, you're going to start your mains at the head of the racket, but after you go down and back 9 times, because 9 times 2 is 18, you'll end up back at the throat. So a racket with 16 mains that starts at the throat will end at the throat, and a racket with 18 mains that starts at the head will end up at the throat, at the opposite end. It's pretty rare, but if you have an 18 main racket that does start at the throat, like this racket with 6 holes, then those mains would end up back at the head. And again, be a good candidate for a natural one-piece string job if you're not doing a hybrid. So obviously, the same would apply. 16 mains, you end up back from where the same place you started. If you had some racket with maybe 12 mains, the same would apply. You would end up back where you started, or a racket with 20 mains ends up back from whatever end you started on. And the same rule that applies to a racket with 14 mains or 18 mains, where you end up at the opposite end from where you started, would apply. So if you had a racket with only 10 mains, or there's a racket out there that's got 22 mains, it would end up at the opposite end. Basically, if you take the total number of mains and divide it by 2, and you end up with an even number, like 16 mains divided by 2 gives you 8, 8 being an even number, you end up back at the same end that you started. Whatever end you started from, you'll end up back there. And if you end up with an odd number, so if you take 14 or 18 and you divide that by 2, you'd get 7 or respectively 9. Those numbers being an odd number means you'll end up at the opposite end from where you started. But enough about where the mains start and where they end. So that's kind of some remedial stuff. So now I want to talk about my golden rule of one-piece stringing. I've got this golden rule for one-piece stringing, and that includes the natural one-piece string jobs that I mentioned, where the mains naturally end at the head and you're going to do the crosses from the top down, in addition to all around the world patterns. Because when you're doing a one-piece stringing, whether it's a natural one-piece string job or an around the world pattern, you're going to have transitions where you transition from a main to a cross, or from a cross to a main, and in the case of a lot of around the world patterns, there'll be multiple transitions. Even on a natural one-piece string job. Let me take this off and show you a couple rackets and some examples. So this is a Wilson N-Tour 95. It's got a 16 by 20 pattern. The mains, there's 6 holes here in the throat, so the mains start at the throat and they end up back at the throat, which is why you see these 2 knots down here tied at 6th throat. And that's the knot for the bottom cross. So this racket has mains that end at the throat and would be a candidate for an around the world pattern. So you have to look at places like the outer mains or final mains, which in this case would be traveling in this direction. You'll notice, if you look, let me spin the racket around, you'll notice that the outer mains, where they transition, or they come in, there's an intersection here with the 3rd cross from the bottom, that these 2 grommets are in very close proximity to each other. And of course the same thing over here. That knot is obscuring your view a little bit, but it's the same close. There's barely any space between these 2 grommets. Same thing up here, this outer main and the 3rd cross down from the top, very close to each other here, and the same thing on the same situation on the opposite side. So any pattern that would be transitioning, say, from an outer main to this 3rd cross from the top, or an outer main to the 3rd cross from the bottom here, or from the 3rd cross to an outer main. It doesn't really matter whether you're going from crosses to mains or mains to crosses. If you're making that transition, then you want to have enough space between those grommets to support the pressure that's going to be created, especially if that string is going through the frame and creating a 270-degree turn. So on this particular racket, that's a spot to look out for up here. Most of the other grommets have plenty of space between them. And not all around the world patterns would necessarily make a transition at that point, but that's your key areas, your trouble spots that you'd be looking out for when you're considering various around the world patterns for this frame. And that's how you're going to rule out ones that would incorporate a transition between these 2 strings. And you want to find an around the world pattern that does not involve a transition directly between, say, this 3rd cross and this outer main, or this 3rd cross on the bottom and an outer main. So this is a racket that actually would use an around the world pattern. Now let me show you a couple rackets that the mains actually do end at the head end of the racket anyway. So they would be a natural 1-piece string job, and you still have to watch out for the transitions there too. So here's an old Prince Graduate oversized. It's a 16 by 19, and it's currently strung 2-piece with a hybrid, but if you imagine this racket strung with 1 piece of string, the outer mains would be coming up toward the head of the racket, and on one side, whatever your short side was, it would get tied off. But the long side would need to transition from the outer main to the top cross. And as you can see here on this racket, that's not a problem. There's plenty of space there. So you might be thinking, it's no problem. And it isn't if you do it the traditional style of 1-piece stringing, where you tie off the short side, the outer main gets tied off, and the other outer main transitions to the top cross, and then you continue down the racket. However, a lot of stringers, myself included, if they can, will incorporate, rather than tying off the short side outer main, which will have a little bit of a tension loss, many of us will like to use the short side for the top cross and then tie off, so that it's the top cross that precedes the tie off knot rather than the outer main. And if you do that with this racket, your outer main would come up on the short side, and instead of being tied off immediately, would transition to the top cross. Again, no problem there with the spacing, and it gets tied off. But the problem would arise on the long side. On the long side, you would have this outer main going up, and then rather than transitioning to the top cross, because the short side already took care of that, you would need to transition from this outer main to the 2nd cross to continue down. And that's the transition. So now what you have to consider is the transition between an outer main and the second cross. And that spacing is a little tight there. I mean, it's not the smallest I've ever seen, but I don't feel super comfortable doing it either. So if I do string this racket one piece, I actually do just tie off the short side and live with a little bit of a tension loss there, rather than running the risk of collapsing the frame here on a transition where the grommets might be a little too close together. This is, again, not that small of a transition, but it's one to at least take note of. And I'll show you another example. So here's another racket that has 8 holes in the throat, 16 mains, so the mains naturally end at the top. You'll see the mains are tied off here and here. This is a Prince Phantom Pro 100. So if I were to string this one piece, you can see the same thing as the last racket. The outer main will transition to the top cross without any issue at all. There's plenty of space between those two grommets. However, if you do that and have the top cross incorporated with the short side, then the long side would need to transition directly to the second cross, and that's got a bit of a tight quarters there, just like on that Graduate that I showed you. So this racket and the Graduate, in my eyes, are the same issue, in that I don't feel really super comfortable with that transition and the spacing between there. So again, if I were stringing this one piece, I would just live with the fact that I would tie off the short side in the customary, old school, traditional, natural one-piece string job, and just let the long side transition to the top cross and go down. But when possible, I do like to use the short side, the top cross with the short side, so that the only two strings that precede a tie off would be the top cross and the bottom cross. So as you can see, even a natural one-piece string job, you still have to take into consideration your transitions from mains to crosses or crosses to mains. So we're going to take this off and put that Head Graphene Touch Instinct Light back on here. So here's the racket we're going to string. And since this racket doesn't already have strings in it, it's not as easy to see those transitions like the examples that I just showed you with those strung frames. So to make this easy to kind of conceptualize and see, if I just go around and look at the grommets that might be close to one another, close proximity, there's two grommets very close to each other in each of the four corners. And to make that easy to see, I've taken little pieces of paper reinforcements, colored ones, so that it'll be easier to see on the camera, and I've marked the grommets that we're concerned with. And I already took a measurement, in case you're curious, like how close these grommets are to each other. If I measure from the center of the hole to the center of the hole of these two neighboring grommets in each of these four corners, they're from center to center, it's actually 8 millimeters apart. But what you have to consider is the frame. If you were to take the grommets out of the frame and only look at the holes that are drilled through the frame and measure from the edge, closest edge to closest edge, they're only 5 millimeters apart. In other words, there's only 5 millimeters of actual graphite supporting that transition to take all of the stress and all of the pressure that you might be pulling on there. So from center to center of those holes, it's 8 millimeters, but it's really only about 5 millimeters that's supporting all that pressure. So to make it easier to see on camera, what I did is the grommets that are relevant here are actually the 8th grommet at the head, so 8 head and 8 head up here, which is where the top cross will be. This racket has a 16 by 19 pattern. It skips 8 head and 8 throat, which, if you're familiar with stringing, means that's where the top cross and the bottom crosses are going to be. They're the only skips, and They are two of the key spots here. So imagine that this is the top cross here. So the top cross I've marked with the orange circles, and the bottom cross, which is 8th throat, I've also marked with orange circles. So basically your skips, your 8 head and 8 throat, are where all of the orange circles are. And then the grommet that's very close to these 8 throat and 8 head grommets is 9 head and 9 throat, which is where your outer mains will be. The final mains, the 8th main on each side, will be here where the pink circles are. So basically the orange circles are at 8 head and 8 throat, the pink circles are at 9 head and 9 throat. And that's where that 5 millimeters of space is coming into play. So as long as we go through an around the world pattern sequence and we find an around the world pattern that does not transition directly from the 8th to the 9th, we'll be okay. So let's go through some around the world patterns and see if we can find one that won't, in other words, if we have transitions from the orange grommet to the pink or pink to orange in any direction, in any spot, that would be a violation to my so-called golden rule of stringing. So I want to find an around the world pattern that does not have the string transition from the 8th main, from the 8th head to the 9th head, or 9th head to the 8th head, or 8th throat to 9th throat, or 9th throat to 8th throat. So I don't want any strings directly transitioning on these marked grommets here. So let's go through some around the world patterns. And let's start with the universal around the world pattern, or the so-called universal around the world pattern. As I mentioned before, contrary to what the name would suggest, it is not really universal due to the outer mains transitioning to the second cross. So that outer main to second cross transition can be a problem on certain rackets. So before we look at this racket, let me pull out some, because again, the universal around the world is pretty commonly used. If there's one that's probably used more than any other, it probably would be the universal. But I really want to stress to you that it is not universal, and there's lots and lots of rackets where it would not be a good idea to use the universal around the world pattern. So I'm going to show you a few of those rackets, and they're pretty common. You know, it's not like some bizarre off-the-wall racket that almost nobody uses. These are very, very common rackets. So first one I'll grab is a Prince Original Graphite. So here's a POG. This is the original size, the 107. So it's a 16 by 19 pattern. And if you were to use the universal around the world pattern, again, this is somewhat assuming that you're familiar with these patterns, so I'm not going to, the purpose is not to teach you each of these patterns, but to show you the pros and cons, where the pitfalls are on certain ones. So if you use an around the world pattern on this racket, and the short side is on the left from your viewpoint, the penultimate main, in this case the 7th main, would come up and transition to the top cross and be held with a starting clamp on the outside of the frame. The long side, you would do all 8 of the mains on the long side, which means the 8th main on the long side would be going down, transition to the bottom cross, over, and then come up, filling in the outer main on the short side. And as you can see, there's plenty of space there between the outer main and the bottom cross, so there's no problem transitioning there. The one spot that's a problem using the universal around the world pattern on this frame is when you go around the world and you're coming back up this outer main on the short side, because remember the top cross has already been filled in and held with a starting clamp because it was part of the short side. So that means that this long side string that's gone around has to transition from the outer main to the second cross. So in other words, our transition is between these two grommets, outer main to second cross. And as you can see, there's not a lot of space there. Sort of similar to when I showed you the Prince Graduate and the Prince Phantom Pro. Even though this racket actually would require around the world because the mains do normally end at the throat. But the point is the transition here is of concern. So I would not use a universal around the world pattern on this particular frame. Let's take a look at another, and this is obviously an iconic frame, very popular. So this is not some, you know, one-off thing that you're never going to see coming through your shop or your club or whatever. So next frame that proves that the universal around the world would not be a good candidate is another classic iconic racket. This is a head liquid metal radical oversized, which has an 18 by 19 string pattern. And most of the oversized radicals, before they stopped making them, so it doesn't really matter if you've got a liquid metal radical like this, or perhaps the flex point radical, or the microgel radical, or the TI radical. All of those oversized radicals were 18 by 19 patterns. So here's where you incur a problem using the universal around the world on this frame. Same thing as the Prince graphite. When you go around the world, there's tons of space between the outer main and the bottom cross here. But when you come back up on this side and you transition from the outer main to the second cross, it's even tighter. There's even less space between these two grommets than there was on the Prince graphite. So I can't even get my setting off tool through there, and I can just barely get my regular awl about halfway down before it binds. So these two grommets are exceptionally close together, and there's no way in the world I would tempt fate by using a universal around the world, pulling tension on that, making a 270 degree turn through the frame, and then pulling tension on that second cross. So this is the problem here. So there are other around the world patterns that work well on these frames. I'm just showing you why the universal, or so-called universal around the world pattern, doesn't work well on every frame. One more example of a racket that does not work well with the universal around the world pattern. Another classic, mega classic, iconic racket, Babolat Aero Pro drives. Obviously they stopped making Aero Pro drives in 2013, which this is the 2013 model here. The pattern is a 16 by 19 pattern. The skips are only at 8 head and 8 throat. And same issue on this frame as well. Plenty of spacing, outer main to bottom cross to outer main. But as the outer main comes up and you fill it in and you have to transition to the second cross, same problem here between these two strings as on the liquid metal radical that I just showed you. So these are three widely popular frames that the universal, so-called universal around the world pattern would not be a good candidate at all, in my opinion. Not to mention that if you're familiar with the universal around the world pattern, there's going to be a number of hard weaves to contend with as well. But I'm not even talking about hard weaves versus less hard weaves. I'm just talking about transitions and the integrity of preserving the integrity of the frame by not putting too much pressure on a tiny little piece of graphite, small section of graphite. And for those of you who are curious, so this is the Aero Pro drive, the last year of the Aero Pro drive with this particular pattern, skipping 8 head, 8 throat. And you'll notice I just showed you the problem area there, transitioning from the outer main to the second cross. And in 2016, when the pure Aeros took the place of the Aero Pro drives, the string pattern, although it's still a 16-19, is different because now it skips 7 and 9 head and 7 and 9 throat, like lots of Wilsons, lots of other rackets. So it went from skipping 8 head, 8 throat, like a lot of Prince's and Yonex rackets, to skipping 7, 9 head, 7, 9 throat. And by doing that, you'll notice that you no longer have the same problem. So in other words, the universal around the world pattern can now be used, because if you follow this around, of course, there's still tons of space between the outer main, the bottom cross to the outer main. And when this outer main comes up and you have to transition to the second cross, you have plenty of room now because the skips are different on the Pure Aero series, whether it's the 2016 or the 2019. So basically it makes all the difference in the world. You know, they tweaked this frame and changed the string pattern slightly, and these holes got a little further apart, a little different drilling, and suddenly a pattern that may have not worked on it before now does. Not to mention this racket's got the channels on the outside, special grommet system, so the string has to lay inside the channels, and that's fun to find, to work through and figure out which around the world patterns not only don't violate the golden rule regarding the transitions, but also will have all the strings lay inside the channel grommets. In fact, this racket that I've strung is strung with an around the world pattern. There's only 2 knots, one here and one here at their correct tie-off holes, and all the strings are inside of the channel all the way around. No crossovers, no problems, and this particular one was done with a DireDesire around the world pattern, but that doesn't mean the DireDesire around the world pattern works perfect or great on all rackets either. So, but interesting that the Aero Pro drive, once it became the Pure Aero, changed things. And here's another example, talking about the universal around the world. This would work perfectly fine. This is a Wilson racket. It skips 7 and 9 head, 7 and 9 throat. If you follow the periphery strings, there's lots of space between this outer main and the bottom cross to the outer main, and the outer main to the second cross is very much like that Pure Aero. So this racket and that Pure Aero would be good candidates if you wanted to use the universal around the world. So a couple of examples of 3 rackets that wouldn't be good and a couple rackets that would be fine. So let's talk about this racket. So if we wanted to use the universal around the world pattern on this frame, which is a head graphene touch instinct light, then let's look at how the string would run. We wouldn't have any problems with the short side if we were doing the universal around the world, because the penultimate main would come up, which would be the 7th main, would come up here and would transition to the top cross. And you can see there's plenty of space between these 2 grommets, and that would be held over here on the outside of the frame with a starting clamp. So there's no issue on the spacing for the short side, so no problems with that. But let's look at the long side. The long side would be coming down the 8th main, outer main, final main, on the long side, like so, and would directly transition to the bottom cross, which is at 8th throat. And as you can see, those are the 2 stickers that are side by side, the 2 grommets that are only 5 millimeters apart. You would have a direct transition there. Furthermore, if you continued on with your bottom cross going over, the next transition would be from the bottom cross to the outer main on the short side. Again, a transition between these 2 grommets that are side by side and only 5 millimeters apart. So already there's 2 spots from outer main to bottom cross, and then again from the bottom cross to the outer main, where this universal around the world pattern would violate the golden rule. Plus, if you went through with this, you would end up having 9 hard weaves on this racket. This racket having 19 crosses, all of the even numbered crosses, so cross number 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, and 18. 9 separate strings. Every other string would have to be a hard weave. So that would be the universal around the world pattern. So we don't want to use that one. So we rule that one out. What if we were to use the Parnell around the world pattern? Which the Parnell around the world pattern, if you're not familiar with it, is basically just a variant of the universal around the world. The short side does exactly the same thing as the I'm sorry, that's not true. The short side doesn't do the exact same thing. So I'll run through that in a moment. Now, the common problem, it's a very common issue with the Parnell around the world pattern. It was primarily suited, Richard Parnell came up with this variant of the universal. It's primarily suited for, or potentially suited for rackets that have the double skips at the throat. So rackets like this End Tour that we just had out a minute ago. Now, the short side goes down the, if you have 8 mains on the short side, let's say it's 16 mains, so the 6th main goes down, transitions to the bottom cross, which goes over, transitions to the 2nd from bottom cross, loops back through the frame, fills in the 7th main going up, and then the top cross, and is held with a starting clamp. So basically the short side does 6 mains, bottom cross, 2nd from bottom cross, 7th main goes up, top cross, hold with a starting clamp. The long side then is responsible for going down this side just like the universal, but now it doesn't go to the bottom cross because those two are already there. It has to loop from here to the 3rd cross from the bottom. In other words, the very spot where it's a super tight transition that I pointed out earlier here. So this racket would not be a very good candidate at all for the Parnell around the world because you're making a super tight transition here and here before you resume the rest of the racket. This Wilson Juice has the same issue. If you look down here, if you were to use the Parnell around the world pattern, the short side would already have filled in the bottom 2 crosses, which means the long side has to go down this outer main and transition, make a 270-degree turn through the frame here into the 3rd cross from the bottom, go across, make another tight transition here. I can't even fit my awl through that space right there. There's not much room between those grommets, and so again I wouldn't feel comfortable making that transition, which would be a requisite transition trying to use the Parnell around the world pattern on this racket. And then one more example of where the Parnell around the world pattern would fall short is this Prince Triple Threat Scream. Same problem down here. Super tight transition from the outer main to the 3rd from bottom cross. Same problem on this side. Here's a Wilson BLX1. Again, same problem here, where this outer main, the transition to this 3rd cross from the bottom is very small. And all 3 of the rackets that I just showed you, that Wilson End Tour, that Wilson Juice, that Prince Scream, all of those rackets have the double skips at the bottom, like 7 and 9 here, which is exactly the scenario. If you watch the video by Richard Parnell on his Parnell around the world, which again is just a variant of the universal, he comments how it's seemingly great for rackets that have the 2 skips at the bottom, or as he puts it, 2 crosses below the outer main. In other words, if the outer main connects to the frame here, there's only 2 crosses below that point. It's just another way of saying 2 skips. So all these rackets that have the 2 skips at 7 and 9 that I've shown you are the exact scenario that he says the pattern works great for. He does not mention the fact that by doing that particular pattern, you need to make sure that you have a lot of space between these 2 grommets up here when the long side goes around the world and makes these transitions. And And finally, one more example of where the Parnell Around the World pattern would not be very good is a modern classic. This is the Wilson RF97 Autograph Roger Federer racket. And it's a 16-19 pattern, has skipped 7 and 9 head, 7 and 9 throat. So the 7 and 9 throat, you might think, hey, that Parnell Around the World pattern would work really well, but actually it doesn't, because it's the same problem as the rackets I've just shown you. The transition from outer main to third from bottom cross is incredibly tight. These grommets are very, very close to each other. I mean, the plastic on the two grommets are almost touching each other. They aren't, but it's very close to. So you've got one spot here, another spot here that's just too tight of a turn with too little graphite to support that transition. So you would go down over and back up into the second cross. So a number of rackets are not well suited for that Parnell Around the World. In fact, I find most of the time it's not well suited. It's pretty hard to find a racket that meets the criteria and doesn't have these transitions posing a problem. And just like the Universal Around the World, you would have a number of hard weaves. 8 hard weaves on most rackets if it had 19 crosses. All the even numbered crosses too, all the way down to 16. So you'd have 8 hard weaves. However, oddly enough, the Parnell Around the World would actually work here in this instance. Despite all of its shortcomings on all those rackets I just showed you, let's take a look at how it would play out on this particular racket. It will work, let's see. So on the Parnell you would do 6 mains. So 3, 4, 5. So the 6th main would be coming down the racket. Let me lock this turntable. So the 6th main comes down like this, would then come, so after the 6th main coming down on the short side, it would transition to the bottom cross up here at 8. We'd go from the 8th or bottom cross to the 2nd from bottom cross here at 10. And after that 2nd from bottom cross was installed, you would then loop to the 7th main coming back up the racket. Before then transitioning to the top cross here at 8 head. So this is essentially what the short side does on the Parnell Around the World pattern. And as you can see, it does not connect the 8th head and 8 head and 9 head at any point, nor 8 throat or 9 throat. That path of the string does not connect any of those grommets that are only 5 millimeters apart. So the short side is just fine in how that goes. The long side would be doing this. The long side would be coming down the outer main, so 9 head to 9 throat. And because the bottom 2 crosses would already be in play at 8 and 10, the long side would loop to the 3rd cross from the bottom, which would be up here at 11. and go across the frame. So again, you have to imagine that the short side is already taking care of this 19th and 18th cross here and here. And so this would actually be the 17th cross going over. And then it would fill in the outer main on the short side. Sorry. Like so. And the outer main on the short side would come up. So this is the 8th main on the long side. It transitions to the 3rd cross from the bottom. There would be 2 here. And loops around and transitions to the outer main here. And then would go, the top cross would already be here where the short side is. So the long side transitions to the 2nd cross here. So you can see, and this would go all the way over here. So this is the path that the long side would be making, and if you look at it as I spin the racket around, you'll see that at no point are these 2 grommets with the orange and pink circles connecting to each other. So that's why this particular pattern, the Parnell Around the World pattern, actually does work on this frame if you wanted to use it. However, after you weave all of these crosses, again, this is the 17th cross or 3rd from the bottom, which means that by the time you get down to the end of the racket, it'll be the after you do all the crosses, it'll be the 16th cross is the last one you'll be tensioning and tying off. So you're not tying off the bottom cross or the 2nd from bottom, you're the last cross. So you may want to add a little additional tension on this string, because the 16th cross will be going over like this, and then to tie that off, it's pretty far away. The nearest tie off is all the way down here, so it's 5 grommets away. So your 16th cross will exit at 12 throat, 5 grommets away from 7 throat where the tie off is. So in this case, you may want to tie off here at 11 throat, which is right next door, but you would need to enlarge that grommet with an awl to accommodate the passage of 2 strings before you start the stringing process. So you'd have to plan ahead. But you could use the Parnell on this racket. But you'd also have all those 8 hard weaves to deal with too. So let's move on to trying the DireDesire Around the World pattern. Let's see how that would play out. So the Parnell Around the World pattern will work, but I don't love it. So let's see how about the DireDesire, which is a pattern that I actually use quite a bit. The short side would have no problems at all, because it's just like the short side runs the same path as the Universal Around the World pattern, in that the penultimate main comes up, which is the 7th main on this racket. So the 7th main would come up and transition to the top cross and be held with a starting clamp on the outside of the frame. So no problem there on the transition. The long side for the DireDesire Around the World pattern will almost work. It works right up until the very end, and then you run into a problem. So the long side with the DireDesire Around the World pattern comes up the penultimate main or 7th main and transitions down to the 3rd cross. You weave all the crosses, and at the end, the 2nd cross from the bottom, so the 18th cross, is going over, and now you have to go around the world using the long side. The tail, the around the world portion is done at the end of the stringing, as opposed to at the beginning like the Universal. So so your long side comes across the racket on the 18th main and has to transition to fill in the outer main, the second cross, the outer main, and then the bottom cross. And if we run the string like that, we don't have any problems here transitioning from the 18th cross to the outer main on the long side at all. And we wouldn't be transitioning from here to here because that's where the top cross is, and that's already in place by the short side. So this comes down here to the second cross. So no problems so far. Everything's great. Second cross goes across. Then we fill in the outer main on the short side. Like so. And then at the very end of the racket, the very last string you need to put in is your 19th cross or bottom cross, which would have you transition from the outer main at 9 throat to your bottom cross here at 8 throat. So only at the very end of the racket would you incur the problem. You'd have a transition there. So the DireDesire Around the World pattern almost works, but just comes up short at the very end. So, don't love the DireDesire Around the World pattern for this frame. Let's move on to another one. See if we can find one that checks all the boxes. So how about the UKRSA Around the World pattern, which is another one that I use quite a bit. With the UKRSA Around the World, you can run into problems with that third cross from the bottom, but only on certain rackets. The UKRSA is a little unique. Let me get the pull out the Wilson RF97A again. So this racket, you'll notice, as I pointed out, very tight transition from outer main to third cross from the bottom. With the UKRSA Around the World pattern, the short side does all of the mains on the short side and then 1 or 2 of the bottom crosses, and that's dependent on whether or not your number of crosses is odd or even. So this has 19 crosses, and so does this racket, so it fills in 2 bottom crosses. So if the short side is doing all of these mains and 2 bottom crosses, that means that the long side has to eventually come across here, and there'll be a transition here and here. So it won't work well on this racket. Same thing on this racket, the Prince Triple Threat Scream. If you use the short side and install the 2 bottom crosses because the number of crosses is odd, this is also 19 crosses, then the long side would have to transition from the outer main to the, or from the third cross from the bottom to the outer main to be filled in. So you'd have a transition there, and that would be bad. Oddly enough, if these rackets had an even number of crosses, it wouldn't have posed a problem, because with the UKRSA Around the World pattern, if you have an even number of crosses, you do all of the crosses, all of the mains on the short side, and only 1 bottom cross. So the long side is actually doing the second cross from the bottom rather than the third cross from the bottom, so it makes a difference. So let's take a look on this racket. The UKRSA Around the World pattern, you do all of the mains on the short side except for 1. So the penultimate main, or the 7th main, comes up the frame and gets held on the outside of the frame with a starting clamp for quite some time. But later on, towards the end of the racket, this short side is used to fill in the outer main, which will go down the racket, and then the bottom 2 crosses. Because this has 19 crosses, this has to go down and fill in the 18th cross, and then the 19th cross, and then it would get tied off, and the tie off is right next door here at 7. So it actually works out really, really well with the short side. There's no problem, it's great. There's no problem with the transitions, lots of space, it goes down, it takes care of the 2 bottom crosses, everything's splendid. Let's see what the long side would have to do on the UKRSA around the world. So your long side is going to go, it's kind of like the DireDesire around the world pattern where it just almost pulls it off. So we're going from up the racket. Yeah, because your outer main would be going up like this. And the very last string, doing the UKRSA, the long side, penultimate main goes to the 2nd cross, all the crosses down, finishes on this side, which is why you had 2 crosses in the bottom done by the short side. So what happens is essentially the long side is coming across the 3rd cross from the bottom, because the bottom 2 crosses are already there or going to be put installed. So this loops from the 3rd cross from the bottom, so this would be cross number 17, to the outer main on the long side, fills in the outer main, and then the top cross. And this is the very last string you're going to tension as the top cross, and that's the problem. When we install that string, that's where we violated our golden rule over here. This outer main to the top cross is merging or transitioning between this 9 head grommet and 8 head grommet. So like the DireDesire around the world pattern, we just came up short of pulling it off. So now let's talk a little bit about the short side around the world pattern, and let's see if that would maybe work. So when you do the short side around the world pattern, the short side is the part that I'll actually go all the way around. We'll talk about that in a second. But let's first see what the long side would have to do. So the long side does all of the mains except for the last one. So the penultimate main, or 7th main in this case, will be coming up and transitions to the 2nd cross. So here's where our 1st cross would be, or top cross, outer main, so 2nd cross here. So this is from penultimate main to the 2nd cross is the same transition that was involved with the UKRSA around the world pattern. So there's plenty of space, and so the 2nd cross goes in, and then the 3rd, all the way down the racket, and all of the crosses go in with the long side except for the last one, the bottom one. So we wouldn't do the 19th cross. The final cross would be the 18th cross, with the 18th cross going this direction. It would then get tied off, and the tie off, since we're coming out of, I believe this would be 10 throat, sorry, 3, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, yeah, so you're exiting 10 throat, and the nearest tie off is down here at 7 throat, so a little far. I mean, you can do it, but it's not like you have a tie off really close by. So the long side does all those, and the 18th cross is the last one installed and then gets tied off. No problem with the transitions there. So the long side actually would be acceptable. However, the short side, the penultimate main comes up on the short side, the 7th main over here, and you have a pretty long tail here, because it's, like I said, it's going to go all the way around the racket. That's why it's called the short side around the world, is the short side is the part that goes all the way around the frame and back out over here. And let's look at the transitions involved with that short side. So this is our 7th main coming up. Would be held with a starting clamp while you're doing everything with the long side, and then at the very end of the racket you would be doing this with your short side. It would fill in the outer main on the short side, no problem there. There's our seventh or penultimate main coming up and transitioning and going right back down the racket. In other words, it's just like it would be for a two-piece. So the outer main on the short side goes in, like so, and then transitions to the bottom cross. And of course there's the problem, because we've now violated our golden rule and we've connected these two grommets that are very, very close together. Furthermore, it would continue on, filling in the outer main on the long side and have the very same problem over in this corner. And then the last string that the short side takes care of is the top cross, like so, and it would be there. So this is actually the worst possible around the world pattern that we've come across yet, because it involves 1, 2, 3 spots that all would be stressing the frame. It's funny because this particular pattern, if you're not familiar with the short side around the world pattern, look it up. It's a good pattern. It uses a little bit, because this short side has to be so long to go all the way. The idea is that you actually install this string, the short side string does all of this before you do anything else, before you've blocked any holes. So one of the advantages of it is there's no hard weaves, and if you get this short side all the way around the world early on, there's no blocked holes. For example, this was our 7th main here. Normally when you loop the 7th main around to the 8th main here, that hole would be blocked, but because this string's already through that hole, take a look at it. It does use a little bit more string, because this string has to be long enough to do all of this, yet you have to still have a loop over here, because remember, this was being held with a starting clamp right here. So this loop here has to be big enough or long enough to reach your tension head, so that when you, at the end of the pattern, when you have to go and retension all these strings, this can reach the tension head. The only alternative to that, so this string has to be a little extra long to make this way all the way around the racket and through its last grommet, like that. This loop doesn't have to be quite so big if you have a starting clamp or a couple of starting clamps. You can leave this loop pretty short and then just clamp a starting clamp here and bridge to your tension head, which is what I do on the rare occasions that I do use the short side around the world pattern. I don't use this pattern a lot because it uses extra string, and I'm trying to conserve every inch of string off of my reels, so I typically will opt to use other ones. But if you always string from sets of string rather than from reels, because in sets of string, unless you're doing like an 18 by 20 racket or 18 by 21 racket or something, or oversized racket, you're going to have plenty of extra string. So if you're, generally speaking, if you're working with a 100 square inch racket, 16, 19 patterns and so forth, where you're going to have several feet extra left over because you're working with a set of string, you might want to try this pattern, because you're going to throw that string away anyway. There's no conserving the string when you're working from sets. But because I cut from reels most of the time, I don't elect to use this pattern. And even though on this particular racket it violates the golden rule in all of these three of these corners, most rackets it does not do that, because most rackets, the grommets for the outer mains and the bottom cross and the top cross are not this close together. So the majority of rackets, this pattern works really, really well. It just uses a bit more string because of that short side. But it's a really good one if you don't want to have to deal with any hard weaves or any blocked holes. But nonetheless, for the purposes of this racket, it's a no-go, and even more so than all the ones we've covered up to this point. So the last one we'll talk about is the generic around the world, or the around the world pattern where you don't need a starting clamp at all. And so that's one to consider as well. So the short side, when you do the generic around the world, takes care of all of the mains on the short side, The 7th main would be coming up. The 8th and outer main goes down and would get tied off at its normal spot, just like two-piece stringing. So obviously there's no transition issues there at all. The short side does just the short side and gets tied off. The long side does all of the mains on the long side except for the last one, because the last one would be going down. So that means you do 7 mains. The penultimate main would be going up, and the transition is, because this racket has an odd number of crosses, 19, you would transition from the 7th main to the 2nd cross. On rackets that have an even number of crosses, you would transition directly to the top cross. But when you have an odd number of crosses, you have to transition to the 2nd cross so that your final cross will end up back on this side of the frame. So no problem with the transition there from the 7th main to the 2nd cross. 2nd cross, 3rd, 4th, all the way down the frame. And the 19th cross, so the 18th cross will be going this direction, which means that the 19th cross goes back in this direction, which is exactly what you need, because you've got to fill in the missing main over here on the long side. And when you transition from this bottom cross here to fill in this missing outer main on your long side, that's where we've broken our golden rule, because we just transitioned from bottom cross to outer main where our 2 stickers are side by side. And then you would have to fill in that outer main on the long side, and then you would fill in that top cross that was still missing. And so once again, we would be violating the golden rule here too. So the generic around the world pattern doesn't work well either. So we've worked our way through the universal around the world pattern. That didn't work. We worked our way through the Parnell around the world pattern. That one didn't work. We tried the DireDesire around the world pattern. It didn't work out so good either. We tried the UKRSA around the world pattern. Just like the DireDesire pattern, almost, but didn't quite pull it off. The short side around the world pattern had an issue, 3 spots. And then lastly, the generic around the world, or no starting clamp around the world, didn't work out either. So all of those patterns, what is that, 6 different around the world patterns, each one of those had a problem somewhere where we were going to have to make a transition from our top cross to an outer main, or an outer main to our bottom cross, or bottom cross to outer main, or outer main to top cross, or a combination thereof. So none of these around the world patterns meet my criteria for my own personal take on when to use an around the world and not to. So as much as I would love to use an around the world pattern on this frame, because everything suggests it would be good for it, and I'm going to be cutting the string from a reel, I don't want to have to cut off more than I need to. I don't really want to string the racket 2-piece. However, this is one of these rare instances where none of the around the world patterns, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, meet the criteria, and so I will be stringing this racket 2-piece nonetheless. So, since none of these particular around the world patterns are great solutions for this particular racket, I'll still choose to do it 2-piece regardless. A quick little string conservation tip if you're like me and that you're trying to conserve as much string as possible, and again, this is more if you're working off of reels. If you've never thought about this, here's a couple things for you. If you have the same string available or on hand in both sets and reels, save the sets for denser pattern frames. So in other words, if you've got the same string in a 40-foot set or supposedly 40 feet, and you also have it on a reel, you might want to cut from the reel when you're doing 16 by 19 frames, 16 by 18 frames, less dense frames, because when you cut from the reel, you have to cut less string. If I'm going to string an 18 by 20 racket, I have to cut more from my reel than if I'm doing a 16-19. When you're using a pack of string or a set of string, it's a fixed amount and there's going to be several feet thrown away anyway. So you want to get more mileage out of the set and cut less from the reels. And the way to do that is save sets for denser patterns or more oversized rackets will use up more string. So in other words, rackets that use more string, oversized, denser patterns, or maybe even a combination of both, the set is the way to go if you've got the option to use both. For example, if you're stringing, a perfect example would be if I was stringing a Prince original graphite mid or the 90, which is this racket. Sorry, there's no strings in it, but this racket, even though it's called a 90, it's actually a 93 square inch head. So this is a much smaller head than most modern frames at 98, 100 square inches. So this is a smaller hoop. It's going to use less string. And more importantly, this frame is a 14 by 18 pattern. Only 14 mains, only 18 crosses. So you're using way less string on this frame than even a modern 16 by 19 or 16 by 18. And then much less string than, say, an oversized 18 by 20 or an oversized racket that's got an 18 by 21 pattern or something like that that's just going to eat up tons of string. So if I'm stringing this frame and I choose to use a set of string, it would be foolish, because I can probably string this racket with about 30 feet of string, maybe less than 30 feet, which means I'm just wasting 10 feet of string roughly from a set. It'd be much smarter to just cut the 30 feet 29 feet, 31 feet, whatever it is that I calculate off of my reel, and hang on to this for a frame that's going to require more string. Just a conservation tip there for you. Also, if you string both two-piece patterns and one-piece patterns, save the sets of string for when you're doing two-piece jobs and cut from the reel when you're doing one-piece jobs, because when you do two-piece stringing you are using more string, at least a couple feet, because you're reaching the tension head a couple extra times with 4 knots instead of just 2. So if I'm going to string, let's say a head prestige 18 by 20 pattern, and I'm going to do it two-piece or a hybrid, it might be smarter to use the set or half of the set than to cut it from the reel. However, if I'm going to string that same prestige mid 1820 with all the same string, I could cut it from the reel because I'll be cutting less. Knowing that I'm doing one-piece stringing, I'll only need 2 knots. So there's a couple string conservation tips for you. So hopefully that was some helpful information for you regarding how to go about selecting an appropriate around the world pattern, how to rule out ones that won't be good candidates for the racket that you're stringing at a given time. Just to reiterate what I said before, I don't think that any one single around the world pattern is perfect or good for all applications. That's why it's good to know a number of them, their pros and their cons, and which ones will put additional stress on the frame and where, and kind of how to see that. And with a little bit of practice, you'll be able to look at a racket, especially one that's strung, and you'll be able to instantly identify areas where the strings naturally come very close to main strings and cross strings come very close to each other. And just because they come close to each other doesn't necessarily mean that you can't use an around the world pattern at all. You just don't want to use an around the world pattern that incorporates a transition between those two particular grommets. So that's why a different type of around the world pattern might work on that racket, whereas one might be a bad choice and one might be a very good choice. So hopefully all that information, I know it was a long video and a lot of information, but I tried to make it as thorough as possible and cover all the different sort of what ifs and give you some real world examples using some real rackets that many players are using, and why one around the world pattern won't work on that same racket and another one would work great. So in this instance we came up with no solution for an around the world pattern. We'll string it up 2-piece and call it done. So thanks for your attention, and take care.